Over the weekend, I was tweeting about the BigTest roadmap. And one of the things in the roadmap is a command called BigTest start, which basically just takes your application how you would normally start it with yarn start or npm start and wraps it with a network stubbed layer. So it doesn't actually talk to your API, it's just all on a client-side server, which I think is really cool, and I want to show how that's really cool. But before we get into that, I think we need to have a base understanding of what BigTest actually is. BigTest is just acceptance testing in the browser. We take your application and render it into the browser. And this allows us to test on anything from iOS to IE 11 across many browsers. And when you render your full application into the browser, you're going to have a problem. And that problem is the network. When you render it into the browser and you start driving around, it is going to make API requests. And you're going to have to do something with those API requests. Or they'll just turn into end-to-end tests and they could be really slow or have many flaky, weird bugs. We use BigTest Mirage to mock the network. And this has been really powerful for us. We can create data as we need it for tests, and it doesn't hang around, and it allows us to reset the application state every single time and put it into a predictable state. Before we go any further, I want to give a big shout out to Sam Selikoff. He created this originally in the Ember community, so if you're an Ember developer, BigTest Mirage will be really familiar to you because it's just an abstracted base JavaScript package from Ember CLI Mirage, which is an Ember add-on. So thank you, Sam, for creating this package. Mirage is basically a client-side server, and it's injected into your app when you build it for testing with BigTest. It allows you to mock all of your API endpoints and return data that you choose, whatever you want. So with fixture data, let's say I have a blog show API endpoint, when this gets run, it's going to return the same object each time, my title and the content being lorem, and it should be lorem ipsum. With factory data in Mirage, we can create all kinds of data that we want and have it be dynamic and create it with things like Faker.js or whatever faking library that you choose. And when this endpoint gets run, it's going to return the correct blog post using the request params and looking it up in the schema that's provided from Mirage. And this is what a factory looks like. So we're creating a blog post factory here, and this has a Faker lorem title or sentence for the title, and for the content we have Faker lorem paragraphs, which it defaults to 3. We can override this in tests. So what this allows us to do is create mock data per test case, which is super powerful. If I need to render the blog show, and in this example, I'm just creating a basic blog post. In a test that might be a real life test, you could test that like, hey, the application crashes when we have an emoji in the title. So let's create a blog post title with an emoji in it and assert that it doesn't crash and it renders all the data properly. That could be a real life example. But here, for example's sake, we're just creating a blog post, and we're setting the title to control over the data, and the content is, this is what Mirage unlocks for you. And in our assertion, we're expecting the post show title to equal what we set it to. That's what Mirage unlocks for you. You can create the data whatever you need. If we would have just done this.server.create post and didn't pass an object as a second argument, it would give us the Faker data. This gives you total control over the data that you supply to your application. And it allows you to put your application in all kinds of weird states and funny things that you can do and users run into, and you can test it in the browser that way. So, for example, what if your test needs to return a server error? I'm filling in a form and I filled in some invalid data and the API responded with a 500. How can I test that? With BigTest and Mirage, BigTest Mirage, before each test runs, I can override that server handler in the test, and whenever, let's say, server.put resources ID gets called, we're going to return an error, a 500 error. So in this test, we're overriding that endpoint, so when that happens, it's going to return an error, and we're going to click the button to invoke that error. And we're going to assert that a toast, a little notification message pops up that says, hey, there's an error, and it asserts that there's a right amount of things. This is from a real application that we have. It's open source, and I'll link it to you in the description. This is really cool that we can test this behavior in the UI and just have a test just for this and alongside all of our other tests, and it doesn't affect any of the data. It doesn't have any side effects to any of the other tests that are running, unless they're nested inside of this describe. So as you write your test for your application, you're going to eventually mock all of the data for your API endpoints, which is interesting because it kind of unlocks a sweet side effect, which is what I was talking about with BigTest Start. You can run the client-side server in development, and we do exactly that. So I'm going to give a quick demo, but before we get a little bit further, I want to address anybody that's watching, like, hey, what about GraphQL? GraphQL is supported, but it's not through Mirage. I have a couple applications that do similar approaches, but you'd probably use a schema and create fake data off of that. Okay, cool. So let's get to our demo. In our application, we usually run it with yarn start. But right now, until we have BigTest Start, we use yarn start -- Mirage. And this will start the application not talking to the real API, but with our mocked client data, or our mocked client server data. So if I go to the browser and open up our application and do a package search, it returns all of this fake data that we created, and it's all data that we specified. So if I turn off my Wi-Fi here and I refresh the page, normally this would never work because it can't actually talk to the application's API, but it still does because this is all a client-side faked server. If I open up the console here, we can see the responses from the different endpoints. So for example, this is the show route. When we hit that API endpoint, this is all the data that was returned and created for that request. And you can see it's in JSON API style. So with Mirage, you can have serializers that serialize the data and give it in the same response format as your API would. So that's basically BigTest Mirage. And I wanted to show everyone that because it's really cool. It allows us to ship features before the API is even finished because we have the similar response format, right? JSON API, but we can get out ahead and we don't need to rely on the server being there to be able to develop our UI for that. And we've done that many times with this project. So I'm happy I'm able to show everyone this, and you're going to see a little bit more about this in my ByteConf talk and JSConf talk.